Mr. Drew Mitchell, good friend of mine, a longtime friend, and did some work with you in the past. But now you're doing some exciting stuff as part of your physical literacy push nationally and beyond. And I wanted to give people an idea of how it all started. And you can go back and talk a bit about your work in high performance sport too, and how it relates to what you're doing now. But I want to give people a broad look at the work you've done, what you're doing now, and where do you think it's heading. So let's start you off there. Just, that's a pretty broad question, but I'll let you kind of run with it.
Thanks, Derek, and thanks for the opportunity to come and chat today. Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting pathway when you and I were working together in with national teams and working in BC, the late '90s and early 2000s. It was an interesting time. There was probably a little bit more in the system happening around a few less barriers around the system, around everybody else being able to move. It seems since that time there just seems to be more and more reasons to not have people move. Inactivity has just increased. Inactivity-based disease has continued to increase. Type 2 diabetes and all these different conditions continue to sort of inflate in our society. So a lot of my focus after the high performance piece has been more so on focusing on kids and to a certain extent the other end of the chain, older adults. So it's been really interesting to see how parents, coaches, teachers, instructors, in many ways, with some of the best intentions, have also been the impediment. We're not letting our kids move freely. We're not letting them, free range. We let chickens do it, but we don't let kids do it. And so it's been very interesting to see. So whether it's just moving freely in your neighborhood, walking to school, even at school, how much movement can we've had these sort of bizarre news notices, no balls in the playground, or no touching other children, or like it's just interesting. It's almost like knee jerk reacting to a lot of things. And long term, what's happened is we basically gutted in many ways a lot of creativity in young kids to be out there and move and play. And what came with all that moving and playing was decision making and conflict resolution and getting along with others and team building, and all that stuff seems to kind of drop by the wayside. We think, we wonder why things have changed. Well, because of our behavior, we have really evolved the situation, and we probably have what we're calling surplus safety, too much safety. Kids can't climb anything, kids can't do anything, they're going to hurt themselves. So you get some really good researchers in British Columbia who are doing some work around that and producing some amazing data that show that no, that's not happening. Not an inordinate number of kids are falling and hurting themselves. Not an inordinate number. Still, kids in cars are hurt way more, being passengers, than they are in any other sorts of activities. So it's been a little frustrating. So, but what it's done is it's led to a push around the development of physical literacy which has gotten more traction because of that. And it starts to get us to think about how we do activity in a more purposeful and intentional way.
Yeah, and it's not as easy. And again, we're both have sporting backgrounds. It's not as easy as dumping your kids into a sports program or a team
Yeah.
or a
Yeah.
right. Because I think there's a kind of a disappearance of the middle class where it's either the people who are like putting their kids in specialized sports or nothing, right?
Yeah.
There's no middle ground anymore. So how
Yeah.
do you navigate that, and how do you educate people around it's not just sports. We've got to look at this
Yeah.
more globally.
Yeah, and when we look at a community, we typically look at the agencies that facilitate movement in a community. So sport clubs are one of them for sure, but it's a broad spectrum of quality that's out there. A lot of volunteer sport. Best of intentions. A mom or dad is voluntold, to be the coach or whatever, and depending on their personal experiences, it's a hit or miss, and that doesn't take anything away from their best of intentions, but we could be doing a better job around stuff. recreation facilities, and in parallel to them, YMCA's, Boys and Girls Clubs, do after school care. They do programming, lots of different programming, and again, it tends to be one size fits all. It's really getting that instructor who can take a broad cross section of kids who aren't all the same ability and still stimulate them in a way that they're being challenged, because it's one thing to run around, it's another thing to actually do an activity and be intentional around skill developing and building competence and confidence. And that's where having an instructor, a teacher, a coach who's good at what they do, worth their weight in gold. And so recreation, sport, you have to show up. So our focus, more so recently, has been around the school. If we can put really quality stuff happen, everybody's at school. So we can make sure that at least everybody's getting something that looks like quality, better. And not just in physical education. How do we build movement over the whole school day? How do we actually make sure that in the classroom, in the hallway, outside during recess and lunch, in the physical and health education class, over the whole time, over the whole week, how is movement built into that, so that we're taking a bit more of a health focus around our kids? Because I think what's interesting about COVID, movement is decreased, mental health worries have increased. Isn't that an interesting correlate, right? So I sit there and I go, I think we've known for a long, long time that one of the ways that we can help counteract mental health issues, mental, states of positive mental well-being, is with physical activity. And so when we eliminate it, oh, guess what? We start to see some issues. So I think it's just reinforcing the fact that we got to have our kids move, everybody moving, but in this case, in particular, our kids.
And when you talk about the schools, the first thing that I think of, and obviously I think of my own kids, and I take them
Hmm.
to school, and you see their teachers, and a lot of the teachers aren't in great physical condition.
Hmm.
Um, but do you think about looking at the universities and the teacher colleges and going, okay, we have to start there because the teachers don't have a lot of resources, to put together games and movement
Yeah.
skills and all that. Has that been a focus as well?
It's certainly a focus. It's a tough nut to crack. This one of the current projects we're working on right now is funded by the Ministry of Health, and they actually didn't give the money to the Ministry of Education. They are funding work inside of schools. Ministry of Education's priority focus is numeracy and literacy, has been for quite a while. And you do get the occasional school with the occasional administrator and group of teachers that change that, whether it's around activity or music or drama or what, something that we consider to be a little outside the box. And it's fascinating to see, but it's luck. It's not the system. And so I think education's priority is not necessarily the health of the child, it's creating literate and numerical literacy literate children. Like that's their primary goal. If other things happen, that's a bonus. And that's not, that's, they've chosen that to be their focus. And so if we can create it more like a village, like, so the school's a hub and we have other supporting components in the community, then maybe others can focus on the health piece a little bit more. And it becomes a collaborative kind of approach rather than just the school having all the pressure to make sure everything's happening based on them.
Yeah, and I notice myself too that we as parents are trying to fill in the gaps, and I don't, like, well, if during COVID I'm taking my kids out, I'm training them, I'm doing
Mm-hmm.
all these things with them, and we're kind of the minority, but we have a different upbringing and sort of a different culture around being active and sporty and all that. um, do you find it difficult to get into the community and educate people, and there may be different cultures too who really value the math and the science and all that,
Yep.
but not necessarily the physical activity? My wife's a physical education teacher as well, but she also teaches chemistry, so she kind of sees both sides of it, where kids just aren't interested in getting fit, and it comes from the pressures at home, like, hey, you have to get a 95 plus percent average or 100%
Yeah.
average. to get into university. So there's all these pressures, but not necessarily a pressure to get fit. How do you challenge that?
Yeah, there's certainly cultural pressure for sure. Along with that surplus safety component, there's a like it's not just one factor, right? So you're spot on when you talk about that. One of the things that in our approach to the school that we're coming from a slightly different angle. So with younger kids in particular, how do we get teachers more comfortable with using activity for self-regulation? For behavior management and so on and so forth to help the child who maybe has some issues around being stationary and sitting in place for longer periods of time. What's a strategy for Johnny, right? And around that, the research around brain activity and learning opportunities when the brain is activated physically, when the body is activated, is pretty compelling. So, you're making a case around that. You're making the case around the idea that activity breaks throughout the day make better learners, make better learning environments, and it's not just for the kid; it's also for the teacher. So, as you identified, some teachers have their own challenges, their own physical health, their own mental health, and so how do we make this more of a collaborative? It's not just the kid, but we're working with the teacher to build their knowledge, their awareness of why this stuff is important. If we can get to the why and get that sort of solidified, then I think the what and the how can come. We're not asking them to. The biggest challenge for a lot of teachers is they think some think it's more. You're asking me to do more, right? Well, I'm actually, we're not asking them to do more. We're asking them to do what they're currently doing differently. And if you can get people comfortable with the idea that it is not more, it is a different way to look at things, a different way to deliver things, and that there are supports there to help you, because the supports in stuff like physical and health education and movement and stuff like that, they don't exist in schools. So this is a bit new for some, and we're finding a lot of schools pretty open to the idea of this. Now that doesn't mean that you don't get some pushback, but we're also bringing the professional development right to the school. The Pro D model that exists right now that has existed has been, let's have a day and teachers can go and choose what they want, and they don't typically choose the stuff they're not as strong in, and so a lot of gaps remain as gaps, right? And so if we come to them in their workspace, providing them support in their area of in a space where they're more comfortable, they're probably more accepting of this type of stuff. It's also cheaper to do, to bring an expert into a school and work with teachers while they're teaching and co-teach and support each other. And so that's been the model we're working on right now, and it seems to be getting reasonably good traction. Our biggest challenge is how do we deal with COVID, and bring people in and have them lining up together.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that as well. But one question I had with regard to working with schools and teachers: has there been any constraints around maybe like the teachers' union like you said, being asked to
Mhm.
do more? Because
Yeah,
I could see that being something where it's like, oh, I don't want to do this. Like it's not in
yeah,
my contract or whatever.
yeah. Every district's a little different. The Teachers Federation in BC the BCTF has been pretty supportive in most of the cases that we're dealing with. Where we need to be careful is when we may have a non-teacher supporting. So we're typically utilizing teachers as co-teaching partners, but we're not limiting to that. So actually, West Vancouver has been an interesting animal. It's been our petri dish for the last 6 to 8 years, and there's an experiment going on there right now. And a lot of people think, oh, well, West Vancouver, they got lots of money and everything else. It's affluent. Well, the school district doesn't have any more money than any other school district. Like, it's not like people are showing up and dropping money off at the office at the school, right? And the PAC isn't giving more money for this type of stuff, and so on and so forth. So they have the same financial constraints that smaller communities school district would have. But what they've done is they've been very intentional. They have physical literacy leads, mentors who are now part of the budget line for the district. and they're in there supporting three times. I think there's up to 3 days a week. There's two of them. One's a teacher, one's a retired police officer, but a coach, and they work together and they are making magic happen. And it's been fascinating to see because they're actually changing the dynamic of what's gone on, and they're now doing stuff that we never thought was possible. And schools are making decisions to have their own physical literacy, a full FTE for a physical literacy lead of their own in their own school. So it's like anything, you show people that things can work, and do it for a while, people buy in and they realize this is, we need to have that. And so that's been our test case, and a lot of our bigger provincial project is being drawn off that. The same kind of approaches, same kind of a situation here. And the other thing that's been fascinating as well is you typically are seeing a separation in skills and confidence between boys and girls. Starting at about age 8 to 10 for girls, their confidence starts to drop off, and you're seeing more teen girls or young women who are not moving as much.
Hmm.
West Vancouver's changing that. They've closed the gap, and because they've really focused on the intentional skill development and these kids feeling comfortable to be and get out there. So it's been very interesting to see that if you are intentional about something and apply it consistently and show over time that things can work, that you can get some really positive outcomes. So this is exciting for us to see it. And the work of led by Diane Nelson, who is the director of instruction for the district, has been unbelievable. Amber Pascal and Aaron Crawford are the two mentors, and they're doing really amazing stuff. They're really a test case for the country, to be honest with you. So it's been very cool.
And so you have been doing this in pockets around the country
Yeah,
and having successes.
yeah.
Okay.
And to the idea that we could eventually scale, right? That if you show, and that's big part of the project funded by the Ministry of Health here in British Columbia, is we have a prototype built on the West Vancouver model that we're testing in the schools. And the idea is if we show that you can get progress, then there's a potential to scale that prototype. That's the whole idea.
Is there funding at the national level too for this?
Well, we've been over the last number of years, I've really switched my focus, very much, sport for life. We're very much involved in sport and physical activity and everything else. But we don't do anything now without health as a partner. So I don't do anything without health unit, health authority, ministry of health. And so now, because of that, we have viable funding streams. So as you well know, health is largely a provincial funding structure. The Public Health Agency of Canada does do some national funding, but their funding stream is smaller. And we're seeing pockets of success where, as we are, I think many of us know, the healthcare system is where most of our money goes, right? Fixing broken people, not so much in the proactive side. So we're seeing more movement, still small dollars in the grand scheme of things, but we're seeing more movement to this proactive side that you can actually, the cost benefit analysis is quite compelling, right? If you can do these things efficiently. So health is a big part of what we do now.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into this whole COVID situation where I think it's pretty obvious what the negatives are in terms of people not getting out and doing stuff and social contact and all that, as well as the health implications. But have you found that there's opportunities that have arisen from this? Like we have over a year now, and you and I are both working from home, which is a
Mhm.
bonus to some degree, but how about in terms of implementing this and reaching out to people? What are the opportunities that you've seen? And I mean, this isn't necessarily an opportunity, but we have seen from the U.S. that 75% of COVID deaths are associated with obesity,
Mhm.
and it's so there's a sort of a teachable moment there for a lot of people. But what other opportunities have you seen during this time?
Well, I think on the sports side, it's been early on in the game. It was quite interesting. It was forcing everybody to really take long-term athlete development principles and practice more because they couldn't compete, right? So and it was interesting to see it in the golf circuit because golf was able to get back to competing after a relatively short amount of time. But guys were talking about how they felt way better having way more rest and being able to practice intentionally before they got back on the circuit. So you were actually seeing in the early golf tournaments a lot of real competitiveness from guys who you wouldn't typically see. Guys who were struggling to stay, having to play so many competitions. Well, you reduce the number of competitions, people get to practice more. Guess what? You could produce a better outcome at the end of the day. So sport's been an interesting animal, but I think this gets back to the quality of the coach. How do you keep it interesting? How do you keep it compelling? Because people are getting a little bored, right? So I think sport's been an interesting animal, and it's been a little tough because sports kind of been, lurching forward, pulling back, lurching forward, pulling back, right? Depending on the circumstance. School has been a superstar in Canada, in British Columbia in particular. I mean, I've been amazed. They started in September and they have not missed a beat. Like they have gone the whole way through. And I know some teachers personally, just like you do. It's been tough. That's been really tough. But you think of the number of contacts those kids in those schools every day, day in, Monday to Friday, 200 days in the school year, and all the adults around them, and the very little COVID that there was, right? Like it's statistically, it's fascinating. Like people were saying, well, school's unsafe. No, it's not. It's not even close to being unsafe. They've done a really good job in the circumstance they have. I think the pods have made it more difficult for kids socially. You've got a limited friend group now in your pod, right? You're kind of stuck with the group you're in. You can't migrate and roam and find new friends. So it's been a little tougher. And that's where I think on the mental well-being side, it's been tougher, is some of the constraints around this. Our worry in the school space early on was that activity would be cut back, and that has been realized in some ways, like cancel phys ed, right? Like, we can't do that, right? But we're seeing some very creative thinking that's going on out there for some people who are getting out, it is forcing people outside. I mean, I'm sure you're seeing in your neighborhood so many more people walking, riding, being around. So I think COVID in some ways has opened a lot of doors to some people to be active for the first time.
Yeah, it's we'll go on a run and we'll have different trails and things we do, and I'm dodging people constantly because I'm like, these people weren't out here before,
Yeah,
right? So there's definitely been an increase in participation for walking, jogging, whatever, and so
yeah,
it's been very interesting.
yeah, for
So
sure.
um, as part of this, now with any sort of push or programming, how important for you guys is the marketing side, like making it sexy, making it,
Hmm.
it's not just this program we have that's this dry, boring, you know, obvious, like obviously people need physical literacy. Like, so
Hmm.
how do you make it so that it's more exciting and engaging?
Well, as I intonated earlier on, uh, if there isn't a level of challenge that's there, this is the problem when you have a group of 20 kids in a class. They're not going to all be the same skill level. So whoever's working with them needs to be able to provide the appropriate stimulus for those kids. Because if it's too easy, the kids who are a little more skilled, it's boring. They'll walk away. If it's too hard, the kids who are not as skilled fail, fail, fail. They walk away, right? So it's finding that challenge zone that's really important, and it's not to forget that just because you're building skills and you're doing different activities, fun has to be the factor, and kids need to drive the bus. Like, get the kids more involved in creating stuff, be more creative. And I think those educators and those instructors and those coaches that are getting kids more engaged around either the design or the delivery of activities are having more success because the kids have buy-in. And it gets back to my earlier comment. Adults need to either be positive contributors to this process or get the heck out of the way, because we have, as a collective group, adults, parents, all of us, we're all complicit. We have in many ways blocked, because we think we're making the best decision, a lot of things that could benefit kids, and we need to do less of that. And we need to empower them more and get more student leaders, like high school kids as student leaders for younger kids, which, again, some high schools do really well with their leadership programs. Um, and like, I just think that kids have huge potential, and we need to tap into it way more. And so that's been something, when you look at it from, from that perspective, I think you can keep people more engaged because they have more buy-in.
Do you okay, so I'm turning 52, you're a little older than me, and I found that I cannot out exercise my food intake, right? So I used to be able to do that. Oh, I have like a big meal. I'm gonna go work it off. And now I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, I can't do that. How much education around nutrition and diet do you guys have, if any? And do you
Yeah.
think could you expand on that? Because I know it's so closely linked.
Well, and it's funny because you mentioned obesity earlier. There's this great, I think there's this great debate that still goes on in the obesity piece, that it's not the food thing, it's the activity thing. It's not the activity thing, it's the food thing, right? And it probably is a combination of the two of them, right? There's no doubt about that. We don't, in our programming, we promote healthy eating and we promote healthy nutrition, but it's not a space that we're working in. There's lots of others that are doing that, and we promote them. And because you're absolutely right. I mean, the other part of the problem right now, along with inactivity, is sugar is way too available, and way too much is accessed in liquid form, in candy form, in regular food form, right? It's everywhere. So I think sugar is probably our single biggest problem in the nutrition space, and its availability. I know I have my own issues around that, but it's exactly right. Like, when you think about it, when we grow, all the way through, I'm a blast furnace. I can put anything in there, no problem. We're going to go work that baby off, right? Well, certainly as you age, you can't do that. You have to be smarter. And somewhere along the line, you got to find that balance, even for our kids, to entrench good eating habits for them early on. And not only that, helping them learn how to cook good stuff when they're young, right? Is brings a higher level of self-sufficiency for them. And it's funny with my kids. My son, I have two daughters and a son. My son is pretty focused. His body's a temple, right? So he doesn't eat too much crap. Um, and While his sisters occasionally, are a bit more liberal with it. But it's funny, they're all a little different, right? And I'm sure with your kids the same thing. You just, you're trying to guide them and everything else, but there's lots of, the advertising that's out there and everything else. It's really tough. But yes, the food, and in particular the sugar piece, is really a worry these days, for sure.
Yeah, and I again, I'm probably a little ignorant, but I don't know how much of that is handled in the schools as much as it should be. But you're right. I would think that if we wanted to make a big push, you have to have all of these things at the schools
Yeah.
at a very early age, so that
Yeah.
we can start getting the kids thinking about those things and see those windows of opportunity. So I guess that's why it's your focus.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we're trying to make sure that we're staying as focused as we can on what we're doing, and be supportive of other pieces. The same thing with mental well-being. There's lots of great resources out there, and we want to connect to mental well-being. But I think what people need to realize, that mental, physical, and social well-being are not independent constructs. They're all intertwined and linked. And so, if we can, there's an organization called EASE, that has really been a big resource around mental well-being in BC schools. And so, we're promoting their materials as much as possible, understanding that if we can get kids and teachers moving more, that is going to be one of the things that's going to help with their mental well-being. It's not going to solve all the world's issues, but it's one of the components.
Yeah, and I think one of the big questions I have now is how how important is the digital space, and whether it's social media, internet, just communicating via a phone, right? We all have one of these nasty things, right?
Mhm,
Um, and you know, I'm trying to balance it with my own kids. Is like, obviously we want them to embrace technology, but
mhm.
not be on it all the time.
Yeah.
And as somebody who's running this program, it's a good way to reach people, but how do you make sure that you don't over rely on it? So what are the advantages and what are some of the disadvantages you're being very careful with?
For sure. So one of the things that we've focused in on here is we don't have direct contact with students. We work directly through the teachers, and so our focus is on the teachers and enhancing the learning environment for the kids. Our focus is on elementary K to 7, so there's a chunk of them that don't even that are not there yet. I mean, we know that pretty young kids have devices now, right? So it's nothing new. Um, we really need to get to the point where if they have other choices, that are reasonable and enjoyable and fun, they're not going to be on their phone as much. So we just need to, there was research out not that long ago that talked about, if kids could move, if kids had the opportunity to do more activities, would they take it? And I think the response rate was like 85%. Yes, it gets to that whole thing. We're holding back. And because we're holding back, we are actually forcing the kids onto the devices because we're not giving them other options. And so if we can release, loosen up some of this surplus safety, give kids more confidence and skills, give parents more confidence that their kids can be safe and be out there with other kids, then I think because it's a behavior, this is not a physiological issue, it's a physiological outcome, but this is a behavior issue. And so, how do we change behavior? Well, we need to give other options. Can't say no to the phone all the time is the only strategy. We need to have other options
Yeah,
and
and I
going
find I
forward.
find it I'm a bit of a hypocrite because the kids will be on their phone or their iPad, and I'm like, "You should go out and play." So they go out with their friends, and they're out for a long time, and we're like, "Okay, it's dinner time. Where are they?" Right? So we're trying to like text them and phone them, and they're not answering their phone, and then we give them crap because like, "How come you weren't on your phone? I'm trying to reach you." Right? So it's a weird balance these days that
It really is. Yes, hollering from our houses on the front deck is a lost art. That's
yeah.
how we, ring the bell or, whatever way your parents summoned you home when we were kids, right? Hollering was one of those things. Dinner time,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
these sort
yeah,
of things,
yeah. Maybe
right?
we should
So
I
it's
should
it's a
get a
lost
bell.
art.
I'll get like an air raid siren or
Yeah,
something. Um,
exactly.
so resources, if people are listening, what are some resources that you can direct them to, including some of the stuff that you guys produce? How would somebody get started? Because not every community has the luxury of accessing you. So if
Yeah.
people want to, maybe they're a teacher, maybe they're a parent, and they want to get some action on this subject. What are some
Mhm.
places? Where are some places they can go?
Well, a couple resources. Physicalliteracy.ca is our physical is our comparable Sport for Life web physical literacy side, and then sportforlife.ca as well are both very viable resources. Lots of the Sport for Life website obviously has more of a sport focus, and addresses those, but addresses other stuff as well. The physicalliteracy.ca website, lots of resources are all focused around physical literacy and physical activity. And then for our school project in BC, we have the school PAPL, which is school physical activity, physical literacy. So schoolpapl.ca. Or even if you Google BC School Physical Activity, Physical Literacy Project, it'll come to our website. And there's a ton of resources there that parents can tap into. There's downloadable 1 and 2 pager resource sheets that they can tap into. There's things they can sign up for, tools they can get engaged with. So we're trying to that is being developed and further enhanced every day. Our hope is that people can come and find something somewhere where they can get started at the very least and get a few things bone up on their knowledge and their awareness a little bit so they can start to move to action. Right? A lot of people don't know what to do, right? So it's tougher for them to get going.
Yeah, because it seems like a really big undertaking, like to, we're gonna work on physical literacy in schools, and we're gonna reach the kids, the parents, the sport groups. So yeah, knowing where to start seems like probably the biggest challenge.
Oh, absolutely. And then, there's sites like activeforlife.ca. They're doing a lot of stuff and educating parents. They've put a good footprint in the early childcare space. Like what we're doing with our kids 0 to 5, we really need, we don't really have a structure like we do with school. Once they get to kindergarten, we have a pretty, we have an understood a pathway we understand. When we, beyond that, it sort of changes a little bit, right? So how do we make sure that we're engaged around that properly? um, Physical and Health Education Canada, another good resource. So there, like, we're not short of resources, we're short of action. And so that's really where people need to step up and start to look at the different ways that they can open the doors for whatever people, kids, older adults, whatever they're themselves. Like, I think of moms with kids. I mean, they're the least active people you see because they give up their own health for their kids.
Yeah.
And that needs to change in a big way.
Well, I'm curious your thoughts on, and we'll just finish with this, but your thoughts on Canada and what they've done as compared to other countries. And I'm sure you're on, have your finger on that pulse. But I remember as a kid, we had things like the Canada Fitness Test,
Yeah.
where you have to go through like
Flex
flex
arm
arm
hangs.
hangs, sit ups, shuttle run, whatever, broad.
Standing broad jump. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and I look back at that, I'm like, "That's not a bad idea." Like, maybe have some standards around it. Maybe that's not the best, but certainly that was universal. And then I remember the participation ads with was it Hal Johnson and
60-year-old Swede. And well, there was a 60-year-old Swede and a
yeah,
30-year-old Canadian, right?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
Hal and Joanne came
Hal and
after that.
Joanne. Yeah,
Hal and
yeah.
Joanne.
So can't I mean, as a Canadian citizen, I've always been aware of those things. But how do they rank? How does Canada rank globally with these types of initiatives?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is that unfortunately for the old Canada Standardized Test of Fitness, or the program that we went through in the 60s and 70s and 80s, um, it's pretty vilified these days, because it basically ranked everybody, right? Like, "Oh, well, I got the award of excellence," and the other kid got the participation ribbon, right? And so it's yeah. So reward programs that are hierarchical, nah, they're not. They definitely don't. And I mean, that particular program, I mean, why would you do a flexed arm hang? 80% of the females couldn't do it. Like, why would you even have that as
They
a
would just
test?
drop.
Like it's just ridiculous. Was one of those typical patriarchal kind of approaches where, as a bunch of male exercise physiologists thought, oh well, let's do this, right? But didn't really think about it. And so I think what we're looking at now is, how do we actually create opportunities for kids to um, be assessed in a positive way, and monitor that over time, and use that data to help in, like, what West Vancouver is doing as an example. They collected data from the very beginning, when they started, and it wasn't good. And so when they collected that data, they presented to the trustees what they saw, what they did in the way of a program application, and what changed. And the trustees went, "Wow, we need to fund that," and they did. So they use data very creatively, and they continue to do that to show progress over time. I think there's a proper way to do assessment and to monitor over time, that is not, like, we get into that camp of, are we being too judgy, or are we actually collecting data that's going to influence the way people, like, the way I look at assessment right now, for like, when we're doing it in schools with teachers, it actually informs the instruction of the teacher back to the student. In many cases, they don't know Johnny can't throw. Well, guess what? If you actually watch for 5 seconds, watch Johnny throw. Oh boy, we better do more activities with throwing with both hands, not just with one hand, right? And just something simple like that is it doesn't take much, but like those things are gaps that sit inside the whole system all over the place. So we have a whole bunch of kids, and actually soccer drives me nuts. There's a whole bunch of kids who may have a right foot, but they don't have a left foot. Why is sport teaching them to kick with their left foot as well, right? Don't you think you'd be a better soccer player if you can kick with both feet? So it's just stuff like that that just amazes me is continuing today, and it happens every day because in BC, most of our elementary teachers are generalists and it's not in their wheelhouse. They're
Yeah.
not specialists. They don't understand this stuff. They don't understand why it's important. And as a generalist, they're focused on numeracy and literacy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you talk about that, the handedness or the foot. I watched this YouTube video on Larry Bird, and he got
Mm.
bored one game, and he
Yeah,
just
played
decided to
just
use
with his
his
left hand.
left hand. Yeah, scored 30
45
points.
points
Yeah,
or
yeah,
whatever. Yeah, it
something.
was like a lot of
Yeah,
points.
yeah. So I'm like, oh, okay, that doesn't happen anymore. Um,
Yeah, really.
it's really interesting because uh, my solution has always been sports. Like, and I don't know if that's an antiquated way to do it, but putting my kids in sports, me playing sports, I just found it was just better, even on the mental health side. Like, I went to my a couple of years ago, I went to my 30th high school reunion, and I think we had 450 people in our class, and like 40 people showed up. So I was like, well, how come people aren't showing up? And most of the people that showed up, I played sports with, right? And
Yeah.
so I asked the person who organized, and I said, how come we have such a poor turnout? He said, well, most people didn't have a positive high school experience, right? And I'm like, and then I started to put it together. Well, like, if you're involved in sports, there's the physical, the social, all of those things. And you felt like you belonged, and it solved a lot of issues, I thought.
Mhm.
And so having more people, and now we have a shortage of coaches,
Yeah.
teachers who coach, and so I think that's a big problem. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, just to finish up, but I just I wish we could just solve a lot of this by just having better sports programming and more coaches.
Yeah, I mean, leadership's so important. We talked about that earlier on. A coach, a teacher, an instructor who's good at what they do, worth their weight in gold, right? Like they just are. And we remember those people in our lives, right? Who had that positive influence. Unfortunately, we also remember those people that weren't so positive, right? And that's so I think, to be honest with you, Derek, I think the high school phys ed model is too sporty. Like it's too much based around um, doing the sports and delivering the sports, and it needs to be diversified a bit. And that doesn't mean we don't still have it. It means we do it in a different way. So I look at it from a sport and physical activity perspective that there's lots of other activities. So and it needs to be diverse because you may play on the volleyball team in grade 8 or grade 9. When you learn those skills and everything else, you may play to the end of high school, and then you may never play again, right? So that just depends, right? Is what's available in your community. That's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's a thing. And so what other, how do if we take a multi-sport kind of approach, how do we introduce a lot of different things to a lot of kids so that they feel comfortable doing it? And the problem is by the time we get to high school, the high school basketball team, the high school volleyball team, the rugby team, whatever, they become the priority in the sport space.
Yeah.
And so that's why things like intramurals could be really cool. Like if we had a really positive intramurals program, there's a guy, and his name is David Benet. He's in outside of Ottawa in a place called Orleans. And he's a high school phys ed teacher, and he runs a super successful intramurals program because the kids drive the bus. They pick the activities. You know, it's not just soccer. It's not, parkour. They're doing
Yeah.
they're doing some cool stuff, right? And now, with the next Olympics, we're getting surfing, rock climbing,
Skateboarding.
skateboarding. We're getting some cool stuff coming down the line here, right? So we need to be open and diversifying to different ways to do things. And not only that, provide the opportunities for it to happen. That's the
Yeah.
real goal here, right? Is in the teachable moments, we need to be able to, because all these things need to be taught. Some kids pick it up like that, but other kids need more time on task. But then we also have to have an opportunity for them to do sport practice, do their homework, do their activity practice, And so intramurals is an option for the rest of the kids. After school stuff, like there should be more partnership between recreation departments, sport clubs, and schools around a more comprehensive delivery of sport. Right now, if you're, once you get older as a teen, if you're not good, you're not in the system anymore, right? And to me, let's make the system wide, keep them in there long, and there's a huge outcome. Like, you're right, sport can be an amazing thing. It just hasn't done as good a job as it could in with a lot of kids, and there's a lot of kids who've walked away not feeling so positive about it, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I totally agree. Like it can't be the conventional sport competitive model. You have to have this diversity of
Yeah.
recreational and teaching and participate. But that certainly has to be driven by good teachers and good
Yeah.
coaches. And
Yeah.
so maybe that's where our emphasis is,
Yeah.
like you're saying.
Yeah, I,
So
I think I think instead of just thinking of a vertical model, we need to be thinking a bit more about a horizontal or lateral approach. One of the things I did with Glenn Young when he was in his role in Surrey as the head of physical education and athletics was, we talked about when the kids graduated to grade eight that, instead of one basketball team in grade eight, there would be five basketball teams. Because what happens right now is when you graduate from grade seven to grade eight to a high school, there's one, five elementary schools go into a high school. Five basketball teams from grade seven go into one basketball team in grade eight. Guess
yeah,
what? My opportunity is now gone.
yeah.
So we allow the system allows that to happen, right? And we lose a lot of kids right there.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm sure there's infrastructure challenges getting gym space,
Yep.
the number of
Yep.
coaches and teachers, but
But
I'm
that's
sure that
why if it was a community approach,
yeah,
it would be different, right? Like,
yeah,
we can't have the same pressure point and expect a different outcome. We need
yeah,
to change the pressure point. We need to expand that out and get more people involved. And that's why we need to be resourcing it a bit differently. Right
yeah,
now, we expect everybody to volunteer. Yeah, I volunteer to a certain extent, but we should also be funding some of this stuff because lowers crime, increases health, you name it, right? Like, the positives just circle right out of it, right?
yeah,
There's a
yeah,
lot of
yeah.
things that could
You
happen.
get what you pay for.
You do.
Well, yeah, this has been very interesting for me, just because, and I speak to you, on a fairly regular basis, but certainly you've opened my eyes up to some of the possibilities. Now, if somebody wants to get in touch with you and pick your brain, what are some ways to do that?
Sure, they can reach me at my office or my
At your home.
organization. They just call me at home, of course. No
That's
problem.
your office.
That's my office. Yeah, Drew at sportforlife.ca. Drew at sportforlife.ca. All, the four is FOR. I'm on Twitter, physed guy, and so I love reading. Like, I am a bit of a Twitter guy, and I'm pretty engaged around what's going on there. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions or direct people if they need a hand in finding something. Absolutely, not a problem.
Great. Well, thanks for taking the time. I
Yeah.
was a little disappointed you didn't have a TikTok account, but yeah.
You haven't seen me dance. It's
No,
scary.
no, okay. Well, yeah, thanks for doing this. I think it's really important, and I'm just impressed with how you've taken what you've done in the past and turned it into this very productive and valuable, program now.
I really appreciate that, Derek. It means a lot coming from you, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you today.